Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here today with several of my Cornucopia colleagues, and of course, Ann Ross, who is going to bring us through an engaging storytelling session about her journey around exposing organic fraud internationally and her passion for organic agriculture. I'm the interim executive director of Cornucopia. I've been with the team since October of last year, helping them navigate a post-founder transition. And we are excited today to bring this story to the world. So stay tuned. Next up will be Ann Ross. Ann has a degree, an advanced law degree in agriculture and food law from the University of Arkansas. And she has been traveling the world and established herself what we call on the front lines of the organic food industry, and knows people in all walks of life across the organic landscape internationally, and of course, here in the United States. So Ann, without further ado, I'm going to let you do the rest of the intro of yourself.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for that kind introduction. As Jonathan mentioned, I've been with Cornucopia now for about 3.5 years. The time has really flown. That's hard to believe. Today, I'm going to talk about organic import fraud, especially in the grain context. And this has been an issue that has lived with me daily, really, for over 3 years now. And it's really more than just a story about organic grain import fraud. It's a story about all of the farmers, all the ethical farmers who have suffered at the hands of these bad actors overseas, thousands of miles away, as they work hard to do things the right way. And it's also about consumers who, every time they purchase organic and believe that what they're purchasing is a better product, don't get what they thought they would. So I've taken this cause on sort of as a lawyer. That's my background, and I see myself very much as an advocate for organic grain farmers and consumers. So how did I get into this? I never thought I would be here talking about this, but that's how life goes. And I distinctly remember when I saw the job posting for an investigator that came across my computer screen as I was on my way out of South Carolina, where I'm from, and headed to the West Coast making a move. So there in an empty house, as I was packing up, I sent in my application, and here I sit today. So happy to be here, and please at any point, if you have questions, interrupt, or if you want to make a comment. I see this is a very informal meeting, and even though we're across screens, please interrupt at any time. So over the course of the 3 or more years, I've been asked, like a lot of people have asked, what is it that you do? And I say, like I mentioned before, I investigate organic grain import fraud, and I usually get sort of a curious look like, well, what in the world is that? And so I explain to people who ask that around 2016, U.S. organic grain farmers began to notice that the prices they were getting for organic grain were really falling, and at the same time, huge vessel loads of supposedly organic corn and soybeans were coming into the country. This really raised suspicions, and as things would pan out, it would turn out that a lot of this grain was not legitimately organic. So that's sort of the backstory there. Well, when I was hired to do this job, I wasn't really sure exactly how I would go about it. As a lawyer, I had some experience with investigations and fact-finding, but certainly nothing in international trade. And also, there had been credible information that some criminal organizations were involved in this, like is common in food and other sectors, and I wasn't quite sure how I would handle that. So I started the only way I knew to start, which was to talk to farmers. And so I tried to learn everything I could from them about organic grain, about the trade, about their experiences. And without those farmers taking the time to talk to me, really whenever I would call, they would answer the phone in a field, wherever they were, almost at any time of the day. I would not have been able to do any of the investigation that I did. I should say right now the story through my experience, but this is the product of a great team at Cornucopia of dedicated and competent people, and everybody had a huge role in this. So in addition to talking to farmers, I talked to other people in the grain industry, and I started doing research and writing some articles about organic grain and the fraud that farmers were experiencing. And one day I was contacted by who I'll say is an insider. And over the course of that time, over the course of the past three or more years, this person would become absolutely critical in the investigation. I talked to him probably almost every day for 3 years. And as time went on, we built a relationship of trust, and he would share things with me that I otherwise would not have known had he not come forward. Of course, he wants to remain anonymous. He took a risk in presenting me with this information because his job was at stake. And without him, this just would not have been possible. I also got calls from other people from overseas, people who I suspected might be what I'll just say are double agents, who were maybe just trying to find out what I knew so they could report that back to their corporations or whoever it is that they might be working for. Well, with the information and the help from the insider, I was able to sort of put the pieces together of what was happening and who the players were. But of course, before we published anything, we wanted to make sure that what we presented was journalistically sound, and that we could substantiate whatever it is that we put out there for the public. So a big break came that I think probably changed the course of this whole story, and that was in April of 2018. And I distinctly remember how this happened, because the next weekend I was going to fly to Boston to run the Boston Marathon, and I was in bed getting some rest several days before, and I got a phone call from a blocked number, unknown number. Well, I'd gotten accustomed to picking up the phone no matter what throughout this investigation. And it turns out that this individual, who to this day I do not know who he is, suggested that I take a look at a lawsuit that had been filed in a California court. It had been filed very recently, and that there might be information in that lawsuit that I would find pertinent to our investigation. So I got up and I started looking through various court databases, and I found the lawsuit, and did in fact learn a lot about how the grain trade works amongst some of these companies that are not necessarily doing things in accordance with the law. So the details of that lawsuit really aren't that important for our discussion here today, unless you just want to know. But the gist of it is that there was a large vessel off the coast of California. It was waiting to unload what was supposedly organic corn. And as it turns out, some months later, it was in fact not organic corn and had originated in the Black Sea region from uncertified uncertified farms. So that was that. And then what we did with that information is we put out a press release the next week. And now that we could verify some of the information the insider and others had been sharing, we could put more pieces together and actually present this issue to the public. And Cornucopia was the first organization to put this information out about this lawsuit. And I think others felt about it the way I did, that this was critical information in the investigation of organic grain fraud. So after that, and with that information, I began really putting all of the pieces together to work on a white paper over the next couple of months. And that white paper put a lot of data together that we collected from maritime databases. And what we were able to show through that, in addition to how all this fraud came about, was who the primary players were in the grain trade, and who the USDA should be asking hard questions of, about their trade practices. Because when I looked at the data, it was clear that, there aren't hundreds of actors involved in this. They're easily identifiable in some ways. And if you have fraudulent product coming into the country, it's logical to ask those who are sending it our way. So that white paper was published in June of 2018. And the aftermath of that was very interesting. It was disseminated widely throughout the grain industry. It made its way to Europe as well, and to the top levels of some governments over there, UK, Romania, I know for sure. And I got calls from a lot of international news outlets, as well as those here in the US, the Washington Post, Mother Jones. I spoke with the Wall Street Journal yesterday. So this is a topic that continues to get some attention. But of course, there were some people who weren't too happy about the white paper, and specifically the corporations that I suggested the USDA ask hard questions of. And things did get a little spooky for a while. Apparently there's some unsavory characters involved in the grain trade, and as I mentioned, some criminal networks as well. So I got a few strange emails and calls, and I think that Cornucopia did too. So that was a very interesting and frankly nerve-wracking time after the white paper came out. And it turns out that that those concerns were real. I had the chance to travel to Eastern Europe some months later, and I went there with a delegation of lawyers that the American Bar Association sent. They had become familiar with Cornucopia's work that highlighted the fraud problem in this region. And we visited embassies and also law schools and members of the judiciary in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. I took this as an opportunity to see what I could find out from folks on the ground there about fraud. So I met with certifiers, and I met with those in the grain trade, and they confirmed what I had suspected, that yes, in fact, there were some very unsavory characters involved in a criminal element to this, and that they had been threatened and that kind of thing. So that was interesting to hear that firsthand. The white paper was the first time that any organization or news outlet publicly named the companies that we wanted the USDA to really take a hard look at. And I think that's one of the biggest contributions that Cornucopia has made through this whole investigation and through the history of when this grain fraud really started. But we weren't finished there. several months later, we also broke news about some of those corporations changing certifiers, which was a very suspicious activity at that time. And as far as I know, no one else had identified that issue publicly when we brought it to light. So that's a little background on the investigation itself. Where are we today with that? Recently the USDA has published a proposed rule. It's called the Strengthening Organic Enforcement Rule, and it contains a lot of provisions, some that are very good. For example, they're requiring more entities in the supply chain to be certified, which will bring them within the purview of the USDA's control. But there's some troubling aspects too. We don't think it goes far enough in some ways. There's still going to be no checks at the border in terms of verifying organic authenticity in real time. So we're going to be submitting comments on that and hope that before the final rule is issued, the USDA will revise that portion of the rule. So those are just a couple of examples. I'm happy to answer more questions about that rule if you're interested. So thinking back on this investigation, I was hired in February of 2017. It's taken a while to get where we are with this, and I often think about the questions that I would get, frankly, from people within the organic movement, organic sector, however it's described. And the question I would often get is, why are you doing this? Why are you saying things we really don't want to hear about organics? This is going to hurt the organic label. It's going to hurt, ethical organic producers and all of those others. And of course, there's so many ethical producers and companies, and there's no doubt about that. But it's been my belief through all of this that unless you can identify the bad actors and rid them from a sector, an issue, whatever it is that you care deeply about, that will eventually be the ruin of what you're trying so hard to protect. So when I think back on the investigation, I think that it was a lot more than about organic fraud. And I like to say it was about the truth. And when you think about where we are today with how people view the truth, when you're talking about intentional deceit for monetary gain, there is no relative truth. There is a right, there is a wrong. And I think at Cornucopia, we see it as our mission and our obligation to bring that truth to people. So with that, I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Anne. Wow, what a story you have. Thanks for sharing it with us today. I have a question for you about how ethical organic producers experience grain fraud in the marketplace. What is the impact on the farmers that you spoke with over the years of the increase in grain fraud?
Yeah, well, it affects them economically at the outset, because when the cheaper imported grain of questionable legitimacy comes into the prices for domestic farmers is lowered. And it also discourages farmers from transitioning to organic, because if you have an uncontrolled supply chain that keeps feeding the market here, there's really a disincentive to convert additional land to organic production. So there's quite a big effect when fraudulent activity isn't controlled. Does that answer your question? Or? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from this investigation?
Yes. Well, I learned a lot, really. I learned a lot of substantive information about the grain trade. I learned a lot of actually things about international law. But the thing really that I will take most from this is that there are people out there who are willing to step up and do the right thing, and tell the truth. And they're not always self-interested in doing that. So it gave me a greater faith in people, actually.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Would you do it again, knowing what
Yeah.
you know now?
Yes, I would definitely do it again. It was an adventure, and one that I will remember as long as I'm capable. And I'll never forget the people that I met along the way. It was such a privilege to get to work with and learn from people from all over the world.
And why do you think it took the USDA years to address the problem? It sounds like the SOE rule recently came out, even though the white paper was published a couple of years ago. What was that process like from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think if you ask that question of the USDA, they would say that they didn't have the resources or the staffing to address this kind of problem. My view of it is when the Organic Food Production Act was enacted and came to light, and the regulations that followed 10 years later, in fairness, they really didn't envision this type of international fraud. So there is that component that this was not necessarily envisioned when the regulations were drafted. However, 3 years is a long time. And certainly farmers and consumers deserve some greater attention to this before now. And I think generally, as I mentioned before, that there is this idea that exists that if fraud of this scale is exposed, it does irreparable damage to the organic label and to ethical producers. And as I often say, of course, it's not our intention to in any way compromise what all of those great farmers are doing or companies, but we have to tell the truth about this, and we have to get this issue to light, because that's ultimately what will cause damage, is not addressing these issues. A sector, movement, profession, whatever it is really only as good as it's willing to self-regulate.
What do you think are the next steps in terms of imported grain and working with the USDA?
I think what comes out of this new rule will be very interesting. Of course, we'll be watching it. As I mentioned, I think there's some good things in this rule and some things that we've been asking for, but I think there continue to be some issues that we need to address, and specifically those checks at the border. I hope that it will increase awareness of this issue and greater diligence and enforcement. What I hope it doesn't do is allow or give the USDA reason to say our job is done, we've solved the problem. This will go on. Bad actors always find ways around the rules, and we have to be ready for that. And we have to trust that regulators will be as well.
And within the context of this project, why do you think that Cornucopia's role is unique in comparison to other organizations in the organic movement?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important that funders maintain partnerships with us to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Cornucopia's work is very unique in the sense that, you know, historically we have served as a government watchdog, and that's a hard role to play. It's not always easy to say things that people don't want to hear, or, you know, to say unpopular things when it's unpopular to say them. But the integrity of organics really relies on an organization that's willing to say these things and to ask more of the government and to do it on behalf of farmers and consumers. I also think it's worth mentioning that no matter how diligent a government agency is, often there are people with information who will never feel confident going to the government with that. Maybe they're too close to the situation. There might be other reasons. So there's a role for an organization like Cornucopia that is really indispensable for that reason.
Are there other things that individuals can do, that other organizations can do in collaboration or in parallel with this type of work to keep organic integrity as high as possible?
Yes, I definitely think so. I think information sharing is very important, and also collaboration. You know, there are different organizations whose constituencies are different, and it takes all those voices to come together to find solutions. And throughout this investigation, I was able to collaborate with other organizations and share information, and that was very important, even international organizations. When I was in Ukraine, it was actually an international organization that arranged a meeting with some of the top officials at the Ukrainian Ministry of Agriculture. So I had a chance to talk with them about the organic regulations that had yet to be enacted in their country, and also share a little bit about the problems we were experiencing here. So it's very important that organizations collaborate to get meaningful solutions.
Anne, were you able to make it to Boston for the marathon?
No, I didn't make it. I didn't make it. But the weather was really bad that year. So maybe it was, maybe that was good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And one last question. What do you see for yourself as the big challenges, passionate things that you'll continue to work on in this area?
Yeah, there was never a day when I didn't find a lot of joy in talking with a farmer or someone who had an interest in this. So I think wherever the roads go for me personally, it will be to give voice to those who don't otherwise have it, or just are in need of someone to stand up and say, you know, this person's rights matter and the truth matters.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for the courage and tenacity and wisdom to follow this through and figure out how to bring it to the public in a way to really create change. That's not many people can tell a story like that ends up with shifting government policies. So thank you so much on behalf of everybody for doing that great work. And thank you to everybody in the audience who's been listening to this. If you want more information about Cornucopia, easiest first stop is cornucopia.org. And please reach out to myself, Jonathan Rosenthal, our co-director of development, Rachel Zagarias, or any of the other talented staff. And you can always, of course, track down Anne herself if you want to get more wisdom direct from the source. Thank you very much.